Sénateur Cormier.
Senator Cormier. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Colleagues, I'm speaking today at third reading of Bill C-35, an act respecting early learning and childcare in Canada. I would like to point out that the lands on which I am speaking from are part of the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I would like to thank the bill's sponsor, Senator Moody, and my fellow senators on the Standing Senate Committee of Social Affairs, Science and Technology for their thoughtful consideration of this bill. Bill C-35 seeks to enshrine in legislation the government's financial commitment to early learning and childcare systems in Canada. It should be mentioned that in its initial version, at first reading in the other place, this bill took no account of official language minority communities. As a result, certain additions were made to the guiding principles, Section 7, and the National Advisory Council, Section 11, during the clause-by-clause study. I would like to point out that Section 8 was not examined rigorously to ensure consistency with the additions kerning OLMCs in the other place. Section 8 is at the heart of this bill, codifying the federal government's long-term financial commitment. In light of this, the Associates Committee's study of the bill in its current form revealed major pitfalls in terms of the terminology used and the lack of consistency and precision regarding OLMCs.
Mentioned by Senator Seidman, there is an inconsistency in the bill's terminology. Clause 7(1)(c) refers to English and French linguistic minority communities, whereas Clause 11(1) refers to official language minority communities. Second, organizations and experts from official language minority communities expressed serious concerns during the committee study about the federal government's lack of long-term financial commitment to official language minority communities in Clause 8. Moreover, witnesses before the committee demonstrated a clear causal link between the implementation of the financial commitment in Clause 8 and the vitality of daycare centers in minority language communities. So allow me to reiterate the situation of the French fact in Canada and describe the reality of daycare centers in a minority language context. As you may know, colleagues, it was acknowledged many times during the study of Bill C-13 that modernized the Official Languages Act, that French is in decline in Canada. This is undisputable fact and inescapable reality that we must consider in all our work as legislators. So you will not be surprised to hear that learning the minority language, French outside Quebec and English inside Quebec from an early age is crucial to maintaining our two official languages and ensuring the vitality of official language minority communities. It is clear that a young person born into a family where French is the first language spoken and who subsequently attends a French language daycare center is much more likely to pursue his or her primary, secondary, and post-secondary education in French. However, colleagues, this young person still needs to have access to French-speaking daycare facilities. Par ailleurs, faut-il...
Moreover, should we add that it has been shown that learning and developing high-quality French at the preschool age has a direct impact on the subsequent academic skills of a young person who continues in a French-speaking school environment.
In perfect, current federal legislation provides tools to protect the continuity and quality of educational services offered to linguistic minorities to ensure their development and vitality, known as the continuum. As Senator Moncion reminded us in her second reading speech, Section 23 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms provides for the right to minority language education, and access to minority language daycares is essential in implementing this charter right. Moreover, as per the Official Languages Act, and I quote, "The Government of Canada is committed to advancing formal, non-formal, and informal opportunities for members of English and French linguistic minority communities to pursue quality learning in their own language throughout their lives, including from early childhood to post-secondary education," end of quote. Given the reality experienced by official language minority communities, the danger of compromising access to minority language daycares, and the existing legislative framework that recognizes this reality, by establishing rights to minority language education and government commitments, we could have hoped for a clear and robust bill to reflect all these colleagues. However, with all due respect, this is not the case with Bill C-35.
In the structure of Bill C-35, Section 7 sets out guiding principles for federal investments in establishing and maintaining an early learning and child care system across the country. Section 8, on the other hand, contains a binding financial commitment and is thus the heart of Bill C-35. In other words, it is the concrete component in the implementation of the education continuum for official language minority communities. That's why I'm calling on us all to address this issue at third reading. In its current form, the first sentence of Section 8 states that the federal government is committed to maintaining long-term funding for early learning and child care programs and services, including for those for Indigenous peoples. The second sentence of this section states that this funding is to be provided through agreements with provincial governments, Indigenous governing bodies, and other Indigenous organizations. Textually, this section seems to have two specific objectives. It specifies both the federal government's long-term financial commitment and the mechanism by which it will provide this funding. Given the importance of supporting the education continuum, it goes without saying that the implementation of Section 8 will have a considerable impact on the vitality of official language minority communities. Michel Bastarache, a former Supreme Court of Canada Justice and leading authority on language rights, states in a message sent to Sochi, and I quote, "In Section 8, it seems to me that the intention is to guarantee ongoing funds for groups facing assimilation, Indigenous people and Francophones outside Quebec." End quote. Colleagues, Section 8 remains silent on the federal government's commitment to OLMCs.
In committee, we heard that Clause 8, in its current form, could give the impression to a judge hearing a case that its silence with respect to official language minority communities is a deliberate and intentional choice by the legislator. In other words, the legislator implicitly wanted to exclude official language minority communities from the scope of Clause 8 since they were explicitly included elsewhere in the Act, namely in Clause 7. The principle of implicit exclusion is supported by work conducted by the distinguished Professor Ruth Sullivan. In short, we have heard that the principles of statutory interpretation, as well as the Supreme Court of Canada's jurisprudence on language rights, notably Caron versus Alberta, suggest that the current legislation must be clear and explicit if official language minority communities' rights are to be duly respected. Colleagues, I have to say that in the past, ambiguities in legislation have created a great deal of harm for official language minority communities, which too often have had the burden of defending their rights in court. A Clause 8 that explicitly states the federal government's commitment to official language minority communities would essentially prevent official language minority community organizations from being burdened by potential litigation to have their rights recognized. I would like to thank Senator Moody for stating on the record that Clause 8 implicitly includes a funding guarantee for official language minority daycare centers, but this statement is not legally binding.
During clause-by-clause consideration of the bill at committee, I introduced an amendment to add the term official language minority community to the first sentence of Section 8 after the words, including those for Indigenous peoples. The purpose of this amendment was to correct the lack of explicit mention of official language minority communities, or OLMCs, therefore clarifying the legislator's intention that the federal government commit to maintaining long-term funding for these linguistic communities. Unfortunately, the amendment was rejected at committee. I reiterate that such an addition would not have created a new negotiating mechanism requiring the federal government to negotiate directly with official language minority communities. This interpretation is based on expert testimony heard in committee. According to Professor François Larocque, legal counsel adjurist's power, and I quote, Section 8 specifies that funding is transmitted through agreements between the federal government and the provinces and territories, and not directly to the communities, and this is not what is being requested and reflected in the suggested amendment, end of quote. In order to clearly specify this intention to not create a new funding mechanism with OLMCs, my amendment splits Section 8 into two separate paragraphs.
Heard in committee, there is a consensus among both the English-speaking communities in Quebec and the French-speaking communities outside Quebec on the essential nature of the rejected amendment to Section 8. They all agree that there is a lack of clarity in Section 8 and that the federal government's commitment to official language minority communities must be specified. Le commissaire aux langues officielles du Canada,
Canada's Commissioner of Official Languages, an independent agent of Parliament, states that if adequate funding is not provided to LMCs in the context of the Early Learning and Childcare Plan, the capacity of the early childhood sector in OLMCs will continue to be compromised. He also believes that Section 8 should be amended to explicitly include official language minority communities. Clearly, the government does not share our concerns about the potential effects of omitting an explicit reference to OLMCs from Section 8, even though it claims to be the champion of official languages, particularly in the process of modernizing the Official Languages Act. During the clause-by-clause study of the bill at committee, we heard from government representatives that they had little sympathy for the merits of my requested amendment to Section 8. They stated that the explicit inclusion of the province's Indigenous peoples in Section 8 is a deliberate choice, as they are responsible for the design and delivery of childcare programs and services. In their words, Section 8 would only concern the financial mechanism by which the federal government funds partners who are responsible for the design and delivery of childcare programs and services. Again, according to the government officials who spoke at committee, including official language minority communities in Section 8 would create an expectation of increased funding, exclude federal support for other systematically marginalized groups, and raise questions about support for Indigenous languages. Colleagues, with all due respect, this reasoning is incoherent. By its comments, the government implicitly admits that the scope of Section 8 is much broader than simply codifying a mechanism for negotiation with certain key partners. Indeed, the government concedes that this section has financial repercussions for many minority and Indigenous groups across the country.
Allow me to clarify. Nothing in the wording of the amendment rejected in committee would have created an expectation of increased funding for official language minority communities or to recognize that these linguistic communities have the same status as the provinces and Indigenous peoples in the design and delivery of childcare programs and services. Therefore, for the foregoing reason, and considering the role of the Senate of Canada as a legislative body complementary to the House of Commons, which must exercise a sober second thought so that no minority community is left behind, I hereby table an amendment which adds the words official language minority communities to the first sentence of Clause 8 after for Indigenous peoples and splits Clause 8 into two subclauses. The first subclause sets out the government's financial commitment. The second subclause lays out the mechanism via which the federal government will provide the funding. Collègues, je propose donc que le
I therefore move that Bill C-35 not now be read a third time, but that it be amended in Section 8 on page 6 by replacing lines 13 to 20 with the following. 8, bracket 1. The Government of Canada commits to maintaining long-term funding for early learning and childcare programs and services, including early learning and childcare programs and services for Indigenous peoples and for official language minority communities. 2. The funding must be provided primarily through agreements with the provincial governments and Indigenous governing bodies and other Indigenous entities that represent the interests of an Indigenous group and its members. Thank you.